Welcome. I'm Matt Jacobs, Director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. Thanks for coming out. We appreciate it. It's great to have you here, whether you're here physically in Pew Hall or joining us virtually through the live stream. Want to start off by thanking our co-sponsor in the Department of Political Science. I'll be introducing one of the members of the Political Science Department here in just a moment to come up and share a few words. I also, as always, need to thank the team here at the Graham Center for putting this on, and the College of Journalism and Communications for their work and putting the stream together and recording and doing all of that work. And that's no small feat given the whatever one wants to call spreading around this campus at the moment, where it seems like half of the campus is out sick and ill with different things. So thank you to those who are standing and able to be here, and thank you again to those of you who are physically here as well. A few quick things about the program itself. We will have time for audience Q&A, so we'll have mics circulating here in the facility. For those of you who are viewing remotely, you'll be able to submit your questions, and then we can read them out here in Pew Hall so that you can get those answered as well. We will have a reception to follow upstairs in the O'Neill room up behind you on the second floor, so please feel free to join us for that. There's some light refreshments up there, so you'll be able to also speak with our guests this evening directly. The topic for tonight is going to be on globalization. That's a very critical topic, not just today, but something that's been a very hot topic for the last 2 decades and has had incredible impact on the global economy, on local economies, on individual lives as well. And so we're going to be able to get a sense of some of that. It's my opportunity and pleasure now to introduce Andrew Rosenberg, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science. He will be introducing our speaker. Dr. Rosenberg got his PhD at, I believe, The Ohio State University in 2019. He's a specialist in conceptions of the nation state and has done extensive work on the politics of international migration, also no small topic in its own right now. So, Drew, please.
Thank you. Dr. Nita Rudra is Professor of Government at Georgetown University, where she also holds appointments in the School of Foreign Service and the McDonough School of Business. As you must know by now, much of her work focuses on the distributional consequences of globalization. In particular, she studies why the benefits of globalization have been so unequally distributed, as well as the political consequences of that inequality. She's the author of numerous peer-reviewed publications in all of the important outlets, as well as 2 books, both with Cambridge University Press, Who Really Gets Hurt? Globalization and the Race to the Bottom in Developing Countries, and Democracies in Peril, Taxation and Redistribution in Globalizing Economies. She earned her PhD in political economy and public policy from the University of Southern California, but in my opinion, which is the only opinion that matters, her most important credential is that she earned her undergraduate degree in political science from the University of Florida. So please welcome me in joining Dr. Rudra back to Gainesville. Thank you.
Let's imagine a world in which borders are blurred and opportunities soar. But millions live in poverty and political turmoil. That is actually the world that we live in. As these slides. That is the world we live in. Globalization promises progress. It has brought progress. But in developing countries, politics and poverty tell a very different story. So this vivid picture here, and the one that I just described, presents a very stark and striking depiction of our interconnected world. But my fascination with these forces started much closer to home. So I grew up in a place very close to here, south of Orlando, called St. Cloud, Florida. You guys heard of it? It's so great. Everywhere I go, no one has heard of St. Cloud, Florida. But even though here, during my meetings, lots of people don't know St. Cloud, Florida. It's a very small town. When I was growing up there, it was probably 10,000 people. It's probably one of the poorest cities in the US at that time, much different now. I was probably the only minority. And my father was a doctor there. He is a surgeon. And as good surgeons do, this is not him, but he had access, as poor as St. Cloud was, he had access to state-of-the-art technology. He had access, we had the best medical care, obviously. Everyone had access. And so I was a first-generation immigrant. And as often happens when you come as an immigrant, your parents are from a different country, they would take me back to India every few months. And every few months I would go back. And as a small child, it was really striking to me that I would, you get into this little tin capsule, and then, maybe 12, 14 hours later, I'm in a really different world. And the thing is that my grandfather was also a doctor. And I wasn't allowed to go anywhere because it wasn't safe. So he was in part of this little village called Pandua. And we would spend hours just sitting there and watching him treat the poor. But what was striking to me is, how can I just hours later end up in a world that's so remarkably different? That is just two worlds that I couldn't compare. And it was puzzling to me. How can we all be part of the same world and live in such, and we have the technology, we have the resources, we have the human capital, we have the knowledge. I've studied economics now. We have the theories on how to prevent such a thing. But yet, I'd watch my grandfather, and he would go back there. I later learned that, he wasn't a doctor. He was a doctor, but probably had, 2 or 3 years of education. And he would go back, and they would come in. They didn't have a lot of money, and he would mix some potions together. And I'm pretty sure he used the same injections. And I'm sure he cured many people. I'm sure other things happened as well. But this was the best health care that they could get. And this is not an exaggeration. This is very much how it looked like. So as a small child, and even as an adult, I was puzzled. How can, in the same world, we have such extraordinarily different realities? So this is the puzzle that drives my research and much of my talk today. But more specifically, I wanted to ask, and I continue to ask in my research, because the answers are not easy and it's complicated, is why does poverty exist in an interconnected world where we have the resources, we have the know-how? What are some of the root causes of some of these issues? Well, okay, yeah. All right, so my journey brought me here to understand why poverty exists, to the University of Florida, and I wanted to do a sidebar that this is the best place ever. I came to the University of Florida and I said, I just want to be in school forever. So this is what I'm doing. I'm learning forever, right? I studied political science. My major is political science. And not only is it the best place ever, you make the best relationships ever, right? My roommate from college is here. Also studied political science, drove hours to pick me up, drove hours to come here to listen to the talk. My best friend from childhood, from St. Cloud. I had to put this embarrassing picture up. But the whole point is that George also studied at University of Florida. George was Carmen's friend, then boyfriend, then fiance, then husband. This is a recent picture. As you can see, he's still a very committed and loyal Gator. Well, when we were in college here, and I was taking a class on the politics of poverty. George, who was studying architecture at UF, he would tease me. He would laugh, and he said, "Nita, you're taking a class on poverty. And let me tell you why poverty exists. People just need to get a job." why don't they get a job? That's why poverty exists. I don't know what you're doing in this class. I don't know what they're teaching you, but let me tell you why poverty exists. So for the next half hour, the time or the hour that I'm with you, we'll go on an electrifying journey of this mix of globalization, politics, and poverty, and look deeper at these forces of why in developing countries are the poor not getting a job, or why aren't they working? So now when I go to India, this is what I see. This is Mumbai. And I like to show this picture in my class when I teach a class on development. And I like to ask my students, can you guess what city this is? And I get, it's Hong Kong, I've gotten it's Chicago, I've gotten that it's Singapore, right? But the point is that it could be pretty much any city, rich or poor country. So what's really interesting too is this structure here. Does anyone know what this structure is? The tallest structure? You know what that structure is? Yes, yes. It is not a company as most people think. That's the house of Mukesh Ambani. He is the richest person in India and one of the richest people in the world. So this house was very controversial, but it is the richest, most expensive, the second most expensive private home in the world. Can you guess what the first one is? Not the White House. Across the ocean. Buckingham Palace, yes, Buckingham Palace. So here in India, is still a very poor country. Mukesh Ambani's house, it was over $1 billion. It has 200 parking spaces. It has, I think, 300 staff, its own helicopter, indoor cinemas. I mean, it's pretty intense. So Mukesh Ambani, he's the chairman of, it's called Reliance Unlimited, and it deals with petrochemicals, telecommunications, pharmaceuticals, and essentially, while he was wealthy before India joined the global economy and liberalized, globalization made him particularly wealthy, right? His exports, Reliance's unlimited exports, constitutes a large portion of India's exports. So the stories that we see here in developing countries, like I said, I use India a lot as a representative case, but these trends are very common throughout the developing world. And much like other developing countries that liberalized in the 1990s, and by globalization, I mean open borders, right? Particularly to trade. I mean it very much in an economic sense, to trade, foreign investment. Once they have opened up to the global economy, trade with the US, trade with Europe, they've done really well. And this is an example, especially now in Mumbai. I mean, this is a place in which you see that the literacy rate went from 40 or 50% before liberalization to it's over 70% now. Extreme poverty has decreased in a dramatic way. It's doing really well. Enrollment, primary school enrollment is 99%. That's really, really high and really, really good for a poor country. This is a picture of Bangalore. So many of you have, consciously or not, are connected to Bangalore in some way. Your iPhone, many of the parts now are made in Bangalore. Your IT services, the apps that you use. So again, a very interconnected world in which countries, poor countries like India, Bangladesh, countries in Latin America are very much interconnected and affect the ways that we live as consumers and even in the ways in which the jobs that we have here in the US. So look, these trends are really interesting to illustrate the impact that globalization can have on a poor country. So what these trends show, the first graph is the exports. The top graph is the GDP growth rate, and the bottom graph is foreign investment. Okay. What's striking, so as you can see, India had a balance of payment crisis in the late 1980s, as did many developing countries that suffered from a debt crisis. And in exchange, the World Bank, the IMF, these are international organizations that lend, they came in And they said, look, if you open up your economy, if you liberalize your economy, it was called the Washington Consensus, then you will experience economic growth and reductions in poverty. So that's what India did. They opened up in 1991 particularly. They opened up and allowed more trade and foreign investment into the economy. But what I really want to point out in the top right graph is you can see that it's small, but it's from 1950 to the present. So you see for decades, from 1950 to 1990, growth was 1%. Now it's 7 or 8%. It's one of the highest growth rates in the world. They called it the Hindu rate of growth. It was particularly devastating for the Indian economy. And a big part of that, there were many reasons for this, but India, as did many developing countries, adopted the paradigm that if we participate in the global economy, we're going to get decimated by competition from rich countries. So what they did is they implemented what they called import substitution industrialization. The idea was that we will close our economies, we will develop our domestic industries so that they can be more competitive when we open up to the international economy, so our economy can survive and thrive facing competition from rich countries like us. Well, that didn't quite work out. It led to a lot of corruption and inefficiencies, and hence we turn to the 1990s where the new paradigm begins. It's better for us to have a borderless world in terms of the economy, and everyone specializes in their comparative advantage. Countries like India, developing countries, will export manufacturing goods, which are labor intensive, and it's going to employ more workers and increase their wages. So pretty straightforward. And it worked, right? So not only did extreme poverty fall, but the middle class grew 7 or 8 times. It's not that long a time. I know many of you were not born then, right? Right? Yes, okay. But it's not a very long period of time. If you think about the history of countries like the US, where to achieve this level of industrialization, how many centuries it took. And so you see much of the publics in developing countries experiencing the finer things in life like we do here. And so, not surprisingly, fast forward several decades later, back here in the US and other rich countries, Europe as well, they're like, wait a minute, this is not working out for us. They're doing well, we're not. We're the losers, the workers in the US are the losers, and the workers in developing countries are the winners, right? So there's been a huge backlash against globalization, trade in the more rich countries. And so the story that I'm going to tell you is not who's right or who's wrong, right? There are winners and losers with globalization. The distinction that I would love to impart upon you is that these winners and losers exist in both rich and poor countries, because this is the reality, actually, in most developing countries. While those pictures I showed you are real and true, and that is what I see when I go to India now, well, I'm part of the elite. This is where 70% of the country still lives, where extreme poverty is decreasing, but malnourishment still exists. Access to basic sanitation and health services is still lacking for at least 30% of the population. And 30% of the population, and the majority of the populations lives in circumstances like this. So this is urbanization. This would be side by side with Mukesh Ambani's house. That's the distinction. That's where the majority live, right? We call these urban slums. If you've been to developing countries, you'll know this doesn't have to be India or China or Indonesia. This can be representative of any developing country. It's a very common trend. And this. So when we think of poverty, we usually think of not having a lot of income. But what the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen pointed out is that it's not about income, it's a way of life. That's important. That's the definition of poverty, where everyone should have the freedom to live the life that a healthy life, right? To have access to basic needs. So what happens is that, so the picture in the middle is a Dalit. A A Dalit is the lowest caste in India. And so there are certain practices that still exist alongside globalization where these Dalits are responsible. They do drink and bathe in this water, but they're also responsible for cleaning the feces of the wealthy castes because other castes won't do it. So this is just an example of the paradoxes of globalization that go side by side, because while industrial growth is extraordinarily essential for economic growth, I showed you the graph of what happened before liberalization, that with liberalization is also bringing many, many challenges to developing countries that are as hard or if not harder for those who are living below the poverty line to prosper, which is the majority. So why is that? Well, that's a big question and one I've devoted my whole career towards. Well, what I'm going to walk you through is some broad explanations that exist in the literature of why this is the case, why we have this paradox of both wealth and prosperity and dire conditions, which the famous historian Paul Collier said is living in 14th century conditions side by side with the 21st century. The first explanation, which started in the 1960s, and it still exists today. And this explanation is the reason why they still have poverty and they're not getting jobs, like George said, is because it's their fault, right? And this is the explanation that it's culture that holds individuals back from prospering in the global economy. So this is the idea that in many developing countries, that because of their culture, they are really deferential to hierarchy. They don't embrace individualism. They don't have the achievement motive like we have in the US. And they worship deities. And so the bottom line is that their culture is such, I gave you the example of casteism, right? So their culture is such that they just don't want to work hard. And it's a culture reinforces this. I mean, this is an argument that I'm sure you've heard in the US. This is a very common argument. Much of what I'm talking about today is not specific to developing countries, which is another takeaway point. So what was the solution for those? This was the most predominant argument in the 1960s and 70s. And again, it still exists today. But this is when the study of international poverty and development started with John F. Kennedy, actually, with the Peace Corps. It was prior to that, developing countries were colonies, and there wasn't so much academic scholarly interest in understanding poverty. So the solution was, well, in order to change this, we have to change their culture. So the solution was expose them to the West, expose them to better values so that they will want to work harder and embrace the principles of individualism. So the solutions was colonialism, more foreign investment, right? Letting more foreign factories set up so you could understand what it's like to work, to have this type of achievement motive. Foreign aid was also encouraged at this time. So foreign trade was also encouraged at this time. And that was the idea that their culture needs to change, and it wasn't going to be able to change on its own. Well, there was a reaction to that, especially from the developing countries. So starting in about 1960s in Latin America, there started to emerge a counter paradigm, which eventually all developing countries embraced. And they said, it's not all our fault, it's all your fault, right? And the idea was that in order for us, by us, I mean those of us that live in rich countries, in order for us to have our iPhones and our cute clothes that we get from, I don't know, Anthropology, and Target, Walmart's a great example, that we need to keep prices low. And in order to keep prices low, we cannot allow workers in developing countries they can get jobs, George, they can get jobs, but we can't allow them to have higher wages because that's going to affect our demand for their products. And then they won't have any jobs, which would be worse. So the argument was that the way markets are set up, that poor countries and the poor in poor countries, they'll be able to work, but they're not going to be able to escape poverty as we know it. Those pictures that I showed you are going to continue to exist. So their solution was, what we need to do is we need to cut off from the global economy. So we need to stop trading with rich countries, and we need to develop on our own. And that was the import substitution industrialization paradigm, which I explained earlier that India and many developing countries adopted until the 1990s. And as you saw, that didn't go well. All right, third explanation. This prevailed in the 1990s. This was the Washington Consensus. This was the argument is, you know what, it's not culture, it's not the way the global economy is structured, it's that we need more international trade. We need countries to exploit their comparative advantage. And the reason that poor countries have poverty, like in India, is they need to liberalize more. And it's true. Although India opened up in the 1990s, they still had very high rates of protectionism, and it still continues to persist today. So they liberalized in some sectors, but from this perspective, they did not liberalize enough. So if you would allow more competition in more sectors, then you will see more economic growth, you'll see higher employment, and you'll see higher wages. Well, that's not just thrown in doubt now in developing countries, but it's thrown in doubt here, right? This paradigm, which we call the neoliberal paradigm, there's a huge backlash against it. This would be the globalization paradigm, that globalization was going to solve their problems. Why? Because there's winners and losers. The benefits have not been equally distributed. So luckily, we have a fourth explanation. And this is the institutionalist explanation. And this is where much of my work is embedded. So, as you probably heard, the recent winners of the Nobel Prize very much were the pioneers of pushing this into the mainstream. And so their argument is that countries differ not because of their culture or their exposure to international markets or because of how markets work. It's because they have different sets of institutions, right? And some institutions are really bad for the poor. What are institutions? It's a big basket. It refers to rules and policies and even norms that affect the way in which people behave. Okay, that sounds vague, right? So here it is. It's governments, it's laws, it's markets, it's schools. They're the rules of the game, and they guide how society functions. So their contribution is that there's basically two types of institutions. There's an inclusive institution, and these institutions, they can be rules and laws like private property. They allowed broad-based participation in politics and economics, right? They ensure that everyone has the opportunity to participate in the economy. Extractive institutions are designed to concentrate power. So just the way that they've been set up, and a lot of this are vestiges of colonialism, they're designed to maintain power and wealth in the hands of a few. Now that sounds very radical and Marxist, right? So let's think about some examples. An example of an inclusive institution, ideally, would be education, right? Schools, public schools. What more inclusive can you get? It is inclusive, except when it's the best schools will be located in a wealthy neighborhood. And so you'd have to be able to, that doesn't give equal access to those good schools. Or if they charge a fee, then it becomes an exclusive institution. So coming back to developing countries, generally we would want to think of democracies as having mostly inclusive institutions, but that's not necessarily the case. Both India and the US are democracies. So in India, an example of an exclusive institution within a democracy are these vote banks, right? So most of the poor, I mean, there's poor everywhere. When we think about in terms of developing countries, when they're just fighting for basic food, shelter, and water, they don't have time to form lobby groups and form interest groups so that they can pressure governments so that they respond to their needs. So what happens, though, the time that their voice is heard is during elections. And they get mobilized, and basically their votes get bought. They say, if you vote for me, and they're very open about it. When I go and I interview them, they say, yeah, he gave me a TV, so I just voted for him, knowing that they're not going to have any say in the policymaking process. So this makes it really difficult for policies to be, and institutions to be set up so that, when we do have growth that comes from globalization, that the poor can get some of the benefits. But this is not, again, just specific to developing countries. We have that here too, right? The campaign finance system, same thing. If you want someone to get elected, then if you have the resources, you can form interest groups, you form lobby groups, and then obviously our basic rule in political science is politicians want to get reelected, so who are they going to appeal to? They're going to appeal to those groups who have lobbied to them, who have donated most to their campaigns, as opposed to those who cannot afford to do so. So that becomes an exclusive institution. So coming back to developing countries, there are many workers. The majority of workers are indeed working. In fact, there is hardly such thing as unemployment. That's something we talk about. What's the unemployment rate in the US, in Europe? You don't talk about the unemployment rate in developing countries because everyone's working. They're just underemployed, or they're working as what we called informal workers. They're being paid under the table, right? And this constitute, in India, it's 90% of the workforce. 90%. Only 10% of the workforce are what we call formal workers. And what that means is that they have access to the institutions, right? They're protected by labor laws. They get, wage promotions like we know that you get when you work for a corporation. They have rules against making you work for 20 hours a day, right? That you have access to health and proper sanitary conditions. But most of these workers, 90% of them, they're working, but they're working in ways in which Amartya Sen would argue does not give them access to any real choices in their life. So developing countries have unique institutional challenges. So this is a project that I worked on to give you an example of these exclusive institutions that exist in democracies in the developing world. This was in Bangalore, and I was reading in the paper that this slum was being exposed to polluted water. They had sores all over their hands. They also didn't have access to water. Their wells were drying up. So we went to check that out. Well, it turned out that right next to the slum was an industrial plant. Okay, so these industrial plants in developing countries, they're very impressive. They're mini cities. They're privately run. They have their own security. They have their own water supply. They have their own malls. They have their own gyms. They have their own fancy restaurants. So they're not in need of the state. In fact, I had a taxi driver once tell me that employers from the US even instruct the taxi drivers to take their employees through circuitous routes so that they're not able to see what really exists in Bangalore, which is a lot of infrastructure degradation that is happening as a result of liberalization. So what happens is, because these industrial plants, these were effluents from the industrial plants, bottom line, right? And because the poor these groups that were actually working in the industrial plants, because they didn't have access to these institutions, they were so excited. I've never felt so bad to be an academic. They were so excited to see me. They thought I was the press. They thought that I was going to report on this, and then somebody was going to see that these effluents were poisoning their drinking water. But I was an academic. I published a paper on this. I'm sure that helped them, right? So bottom line is, you see that globalization is bringing this amazing growth and opportunities, and that is important and that is necessary. But fundamental to that, without these inclusive institutions, without those who are not benefiting or maybe even being hurt by this industrialization that's happening with globalization, if they don't get to participate in that process, then they're unable to demand the ability to improve their living standards. So What is the solution? And this is my final slide. Well, I wish I could tell you I had the solution for this, but I will tell you what approach that we're taking. And again, this is not unique to developing countries. This is also relevant right here in the US. Our solution is that it's not about redistribution, or it's not just about globalization. You have to have both. Both have to go hand in hand. If you just pursue openness or globalization, like the Washington pundits told us to do in the 1990s, then you're going to have inequality, you're going to have people that are very unhappy, you're going to have job losses, and they're going to demand higher tariffs and more protectionism, which in turn limits growth and the job opportunities they'll have. So it's a bad, vicious cycle. If you do not engage in redistribution, and we're talking about a particular type, and we're calling it social investment, right? Which is we have to help educate, and we don't mean formal education, it's skills training. We cannot do without skills training in a global economy. We cannot do without skill training in this world of rapid automation and technological process. Both have to go hand in hand. If we can pursue expand access to quality education, non-formal types of education, so that you don't just have to have a 4-year college degree. And even that's not enough. If you look at the data, because the skills demand are increasing so much, what you have is that in order to pursue the American dream, the narrative was you had to go to college and get an education, and that was the only way that there was going to be intergenerational mobility. Well, people are frustrated now. I'm sure you've seen the data that intergenerational mobility in the US has been declining since the 1980s. You can't just graduate high school and get a job. You can't even just go to college and get a job. So what happens? Everyone's in debt. You go to college with people who don't want to be there, so it lowers your learning. I struggle in class teaching people who really don't want to be there. So really, we need a new narrative. We need a new understanding that, college is not the key to success. We need to train on specific skills that are commensurate with our comparative advantage. And same thing in developing countries. Those who have less than a college education, they're still able to have skills training and be able to participate in some types of manufacturing. Because another important point is that we think that with developing countries and them exporting manufacturing goods like textiles and all the great things that we want to buy at Walmart for cheap. But the thing is that now, in order to get a job in these factories in developing countries, you need a high school education, which is equivalent to a college education in a developing country. You need skills. So what we can do in developing countries is focus on basic literacy, not necessarily college education. What we can do in richer countries is focusing on specific skills that allow us to enter the service economy. We're no longer a manufacturing economy. Those jobs aren't coming back. CHIPS Act is great, but those jobs are not coming back. So we need to embrace that services in the US is our comparative advantage, and we need to encourage people not to get a formal education, but to engage in skills training. Because how are we going to get to these inclusive institutions? Acemoglu and Robinson, the Nobel winners, were acknowledged it's really, really hard to go from having an institution which doesn't allow the poor or less advantaged groups to participate to an inclusive one. It has to come from war or some big economic crisis, or it comes from the bottom up, which is really hard to expect that these people who are working 24 hours a day are going to be able to mobilize to demand better political representation. But what we can hope is that if they get not just jobs, but good jobs, then that will give them more resources, which include time and space, to have a better voice in the political process. Otherwise, until then, we're going to continue to exist in a global economy where there's two Indias, one for the rich and one for the poor, two Americas, one for not just the college educated, but for the ones from the really advanced degrees to the ones with just a high school degree. So to conclude, our effort going forward is to think about policies and politics that will help ensure that global economic integration does not lead to social disintegration. Thank you so much for having me here. It's such a pleasure to come back to my alma mater and have my roommates from college. You're going to make your best friends here. You're going to go forward and have amazing careers and amazing life, all because you came to UF. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for taking your time to speak with us today. I really enjoyed your talk today. I wanted to touch on something that you didn't mention, but that liberalism also includes a lot of international organizations and institutions. First, I would like to know what that fourth solution that was posed by the Nobel laureates, where did international institutions fall into play there? And then from there, do you agree with them and what role they should play? Thank you.
They focus more on domestic institutions than international institutions, but your question is very well received. So that's another solution that I didn't talk about, is since domestic institutions tend to, especially in developing countries, tend to be exclude those that don't have wealth, then maybe international organizations can help. And that's exactly what the World Bank and the IMF were designed to do. Now, as Drew knows, there's a lot of research in political science that shows that these international organizations suffer from the same type of exclusiveness, right? That many join these international organizations just so they can maintain the status quo, and that poor states don't have as much of a voice. So do I agree with them? I think there's a role for international organizations to play, just like we need some reform of institutions at the domestic level. Same thing at the international level. But what I do like about international organizations, as they exist now, however imperfect that they might be, they set ideals. Right? They set benchmarks. And countries, especially developing countries, care about how they look on these benchmarks. So they do create incentives, however flawed, for governments to try to increase their ranking on the Human Development Index, right? These things are headline news in developing countries. Oh, we went from, doesn't exist anymore, but what was it, the business indicators at the World Bank? Doing business. Yes, the ease of doing business. Well, that turned out to be a bad thing, corrupt, but they really cared about their rank because it was going to attract foreign investment. So nothing is black and white, but they represent play a really important role in the global economy.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I enjoyed your talk. I was a part of the Mobilization for Global Justice 25 years ago, and there's a different picture of globalization that you haven't presented here, that the big corporations want to put an end to all kinds of regulations that get in their way of making a profit. It was called a multilateral agreement on investment. Horrific. If some country passed a law for environmental or workplace health and safety regulations, these corporations wanted the right by treaty, international treaty, to sue that country to get rid of those regulations. The other thing is restructuring at the hands of the IMF and World Bank. So they go into this poor country and say, we'll help you, but you have to cut off all subsidies for like drinking water or electrical power. And during the A16 gathering in Washington 25 years ago, almost exactly, there were teach-ins before the gathering, and there was a fellow that they brought from Bolivia to explain how he was fighting against the privatization of the water because it would cast many people into a situation where they had no clean drinking water or anything else. Mm-hmm. So, I look at this picture and I think this is what globalization really looks like. Underneath all the pretty talk from the economists. But I mean, you have a different picture, and maybe you can address what I just told you about.
Sure, thank you. I think that your picture is consistent with this, right? Again, the idea is, everyone is going to be lobbying for policies that benefit them, right? Obviously, these corporations have more power to do so. And again, what Asamoah and Robinson would show is those countries in which there are more inclusive institutions, that they're going to be like what we have in Europe, for example. Many countries in Europe have very strong regulations on labor and health and the environment, right? And so one can argue that they have more inclusive institutions, so there's more of a balance between the wealthy corporate groups and the mass public and these different interest groups. But yes, it's unequal. It brings progress, but it's unequal, and that's exactly what we want to focus on and study. Well, that would be explanation too, right? Yeah. It's a balance between growth and redistribution. You need that growth, right?
Oh, did you have your hand?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Thank you for your talk. I loved hearing about it, and I loved the St. Cloud shout-out.
Are you from St. Cloud?
I went to high school there.
You did?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. St. Cloud High School?
Not the high school, but like in the area.
Okay.
Yeah. A lot of the news recently has been a lot about like President Trump and his new kind of administration and what his new goals are. And a lot of the things that he's really pushing for are this very anti-globalist kind of idea of like his tariffs and then kind of protectionism things. So how do you think, like, kind of going into the next few years in his administration, you talked some about like kind of what needs to happen. How do you think the policies he's pushing and the things that he's saying he's going to do will affect that?
Yeah.
And if it's really going to push away from the goal we shall be working towards?
Yeah. So that's the million-dollar question. So it's not just Trump, as I'm sure you know. This is a global trend. I mean, it's not hitting developing countries as much, but some. India's become more protectionist. But it's this backlash against, explanation 3, that globalization was going to lift all boats. That didn't happen. And there's much resentment. So there's two things going on. It's complicated, right? Understanding the distributional effects of trade. I mean, I've spent my whole career studying that, and I'm not sure that even an economist can tell you clearly who's going to win and who's going to lose. So we never sold the globalization project to the mass public. It's complicated, and most people don't really understand what is happening. Who's winning, right? That you win in the long run, the comparative advantage. I mean, so where I'm going with that is it becomes a really easy political tool, right, to blame for everything. And, as I talked about today, the higher tariffs is going to make the situation worse, right? But it sounds very appealing. It's an easy, it's going to raise revenues. It's going to allow manufacturing to come back to the U.S. Any economist will tell you that's not going to happen. Those jobs have sailed. And it's not just because of trade that we lost those jobs to China, India, whatnot, but it's also because of automation. So what are we going to do about it? I mean, that's one of the things that we're working on is play the information game, is really working hard to make this a very understandable issue that in the long run, if we are more protectionist, then both the rich and the poor are going to suffer. So we have to work on the information, and we need to be better academics so we can communicate that more clearly.
Hello. I thought your presentation was so great because it really presents all the opinions on globalization pretty fairly, like the positives and negatives, because a lot of people also demonize it because of all of the negative effects of it, but I think you did a really great job of presenting both positives and the negatives of it fairly. And as well as this gentleman was saying, how a lot of international organizations, they try to go into poorer countries and sort of help them, but because the projects are really large scale and they don't really have a good enough understanding of the country and its political systems and institutions, there's a lot of unintended consequences that usually come from them that often put the country in a worse off position. And I really liked your point at the end about how a lot of growth can be focused on sort of increasing the mobility and sort of that lower income people have, so that when the economy inevitably shifts, they still have marketable skills that they can apply and like do a lateral sort of move. And so I was wondering if in your research you've seen that instead of focusing more on the larger projects of international organizations or NGOs, if we can learn from smaller projects that are more controlled, that are in communities where you can more fully understand the nuances, and if those are more successful.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the right approach. We can't just take a macro level. And the World Bank has evolved in focusing on micro level projects, working with NGOs. So despite the fact that they have had a lot of negative consequences, they are trying to learn and they are trying to reform and they are trying to work more with civil society to do that. So I absolutely agree with you. There has to be a balance between the macro and the micro approach. We can't just focus on the micro alone because that's great. But if we want to think about, how to increase growth, for example, those have to be national level policies. Because if we're going to invest in education, we need resources to do that. In order to get resources, we have to have economic growth. So that calls for macro level policies. We have to have, more interconnected economies, again, macro level policies.
Hello. Whoa. Thank you for your talk. Please mind my ignorance and nervousness. I'm not a poli-sci student. I do a lot of self-study though. So when we look at globalization past World War II, we see a lot of countries that have big economies such as Germany, South Korea, Singapore. They were really controlled at first in the sense of having public services to raise education and boost manufacturing, either from larger countries, from larger countries, or through time they became service-based. The solution you posed was increasing education, literacy rates, and things like informal education, correct? Mm-hmm. How can we do that in the modern day? Yeah, how do we do that? How do we do that in the modern day without, pardon? Yeah, how do we do that in the modern day with small economies that don't have a lot of backing resources or services right now?
Yes. So that's a critical question. Thank you for your question. You did great. So I will answer how Amartya Sen answered that question. Things cost less in developing countries, right? It doesn't cost as much. So you can afford, if you make it a priority, you can afford to have access to these educations. A lot of these countries, for example, have amazing militaries, right? So there are resources. Going back to my original puzzle, we have the resources. Why doesn't everyone have access to, a decent standard of living? So it is possible. It has been done. You answered the question with your question. The East Asian countries did it, right? They were poor. Korea and India were just as poor, had the same wealth in the 1950s. And Korea soared and India didn't. And one of the things South Korea did was invest in education. We need a different type of education today. They invested in formal education. So the types of skill training that we're talking about are much less expensive and much more affordable. So it's absolutely feasible, but in order for it to happen, there has to be a narrative. There has to be a political acceptance. There has to be a paradigm change.
Just have a couple of comments and maybe a question, who knows. You mentioned globalization with open borders, and of course, we're not having open borders with regard to people. We have open borders with regard to companies, corporations, money. That goes across borders freely. But people, we've got a different standard for some reason. And historically, that's never been the case. In our country, since the 1880s was the first time we had immigration laws of any type that excluded anybody. You mentioned the fact that India and, of course, China now before that and Japan before that each had tremendous growth rates. all of those growth rates, I think you would probably attribute to the fact that they have big populations and they imported or got hold of more modern technology, because that's what creates productivity, those two things. So they've got unused population, and now they've got the technology, which, yes, it took America a long time, but the technology wasn't there. It had to be developed slowly, and it only develops at a certain rate. So I think that's part of the reason. I hate to say a bad word here, but Marx, Karl, I think, had a good observation in that unregulated capitalism self-destructs because the rich get too rich and the poor get too poor, and pretty soon it breaks down and you can't make anything work. And it seems to me that that's similar to what happened with colonialism, where you have mature economies in countries, and so they go out to look for new markets and new resources to exploit, and that's, you get colonialism. And our form of colonialism today we call globalization, but it's kind of similar. And lastly, with regard to institutions, I think the United States currently is showing us that institutions alone are insufficient to protect people's rights. The thing that protects people's rights aren't institutions and they aren't constitutions. They're the people who occupy the positions of authority and the ideals they hold. And it's those things that make the difference and would negate the inherent problems that we have with capitalism concentrating wealth and power and leaving many, many people it's all their fault because they're lazy. We heard the same thing with slaves when they were slaves. You know, they're just lazy, and we know that's not true. So my suggestion would be you've got to get good people in place in the institutions that are directed to accomplish good for the community. When you look at a place like Korea, where I think they're a little bit more egalitarian than we are, they have a culture that comes up with a more social idea of things. Europe has currently a more social idea of things. We lend more toward individualism. And I imagine with the caste system in India, that's an encumbrance. Because even though it was outlawed, I know that it's still got some adherence. So.
Yeah. Thank you for your thoughts. Every country, every place has positive and negatives. I just came back from Korea from a conference in Korea, and they're having a huge demographic crisis. I mean, they're worried about their growth, they're worried about their productivity, and so of course I'm thinking, well, let the immigrants in. I mean, they have no one to work. They have no one. That's not going to happen. So as social as they are, they don't want anyone that doesn't look like them, and they would solve all their economic problems. So every country has. Yeah, pluses and minuses. They wouldn't even actually let me ask that question even.
So we have time for one more question. So I'll do college roommate privilege here. So go ahead.
I just want to say I feel like I have to apologize for the callousness of how my husband. I promise he's evolved. He doesn't think we all need to just get a job. To follow up on that question about I just lost my train of thought. The tariff situation. What is your opinion on just the idea of threatening tariffs, and what is the effect, or do you see any effect on changing policy? Not actually going, obviously implementing that, but just the threat and the idea of tariffs on changing this perceived difference that we have, or that we've been treated unfairly as is out there.
Yeah. I mean, we're all waiting with bated breath how much of his threats are going to become reality. And the threats it worked in Colombia. I mean, the threats in some cases have been working, and he's being able to be successful. It's because we're such a large market. We're so powerful. So it works. Where it's not going to work is when I think Canada is now starting to dig in their heels. Europe is starting to dig in their heels. We have China, that's an alternative market. So when he implements his threats and then there's retaliation, I'm scared of that world. I mean, we need the U.S. The international organization. There was so much going on, but the withdrawal from the WHO is devastating for poor countries. We'll all be fine, but the U.S. was the largest funder. I mean, we barely heard anything about it. So the U.S. has a role to play. I mean, we set standards. If we start following through on these threats, other countries are going to as well. And this is what led to the Great Depression in the 1930s, because there was this beggar thy neighbor policy that started after World War I, where people started to withdraw. We had Hitler, we had the Great Depression. It's a dangerous world. So, and it's different now too, because as powerful as we are and as much countries need us, there are alternatives now as well. And I believe that the U.S. can and should be a leader in establishing, new paradigms, being thought leaders, establishing paradigms that hopefully can lead to globalization and more prosperity for all. If we have a different type of leader that emerges, like China, right? They don't have that paradigm. They're not going to prioritize. I mean, we're not perfect. We don't. I know we say a great game about supporting civil liberties and political rights throughout the world, and we don't always follow through, but that principle is there. It's back to we set the norm. We don't always follow it, I understand, but it's there. And if we have other countries in charge that aren't even going to set the norm, I'm scared of the retaliation that will come when those threats become reality.
Well, thank you very much, and please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you to the Graham Center.
Yep. And as I said, we will have a reception upstairs here, so please feel free to head on upstairs. We've got to take a couple photos down
Bye,
here,
Julia.
but we'll be up in a moment.